Hello. Looking back to Sunday's gospel with the confession at Caesarea Philippi, can you imagine? Peter is calling Jesus the Messiah, and the next moment Jesus is saying to him, "Get behind me, Satan." In Matthew's description of that exchange, Peter goes from cornerstone to stumbling block. Either way, it's such a reversal of fortune in your relationship that it had to be incredibly painful. I mean, can you imagine? And maybe that's the problem. Maybe Peter couldn't imagine. He couldn't imagine what this Jesus guy was really up to. He couldn't imagine that Jesus had come not just to comfort people, but to free them. I mean, comforting isn't that hard. Just give them a little more of what they already have and tell them it will be all right. But freedom is different. Freedom requires that they see that what they have isn't life-giving in the first place. When he called Jesus the Messiah, Peter had in mind a warrior king like David, one who would drive out the Romans and liberate the Israelites. And that's a pretty understandable, even reasonable hope. The problem with Peter's expectation is not that it's unreasonable, but that it doesn't change anything. Jesus, the warrior king, would use greater force and violence to drive the Romans out. Eventually, though, someone with even more force or willing to do greater violence would take over yet again. So who's in charge may change, but the wheel of force and violence keeps turning. And Jesus knows this. He knows that by introducing a different logic, one that runs by forgiveness, mercy and love rather than retribution, violence and hate, he knows he's challenging the powers that be. And moreover, he knows that the wheel of force and violence will not tolerate his obstruction, but will run him over. And this Peter just couldn't imagine. No, it isn't surprising that Jesus was killed. What's surprising is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Resurrection reinforces, or actually establishes, that Jesus' life, love, and sacrifice are ultimately what will prevail. It's hard to imagine, I know, in light of how prevalent force and violence seem in the world. But it is just what Jesus invites us to. Lives shaped by love and forgiveness, and actions shaped by compassion and hope. And that's hard. Because giving someone another chance instead of writing them off, forgiving someone who has wronged us instead of seeking retribution, being open-handed and generous with the resources we've been blessed with instead of holding on to whatever we can, offering our future to God rather than planning each step, seeking joy and service rather than acquisition. I mean, because we've accepted that what the world has offered is all there is, these things often feel at first like death, even like dying on the cross, before God uses them to raise us to new life. It's an act of imagination. But as we take even these small steps forward, God is at work, giving us a taste of life we'd never thought possible, and multiplying the impact of our actions far beyond what we had dreamed, until suddenly, just as it felt like we had lost our lives, we find them. Can you imagine? And maybe that's the question to ask this week. Can you imagine that God is at work in and through your life for the good of the world? Can you imagine that this congregation has something of value to offer this community? Can you imagine that when you befriend the lonely or encourage the frightened, heaven rejoices? Can you imagine that when you befriend, though afraid, when you stand up to those who spew hate, God is with you? Can you imagine that even small acts of love and generosity challenge the world order and introduce a different reality? Can you imagine that God wants for us not just comfort but freedom? Can you imagine that love is more powerful than hate? Can you imagine that God raised Jesus from the dead? Imagine what God really wants for you and for us. Pray for the grace to see, taste, and believe the the life-giving promises of the Messiah who came not to give us what we want, but to give us what we need. See you soon.